Thank you, Hi. It's great to be here with you, and terrific to see what exciting engagement around culture and the economy is happening right here at Michigan State. I want to thank everyone involved for the hospitality I've enjoyed over the last, I guess now, almost 2 days. And especially Kurt Dewhurst and Marcia McDowell, who have been so generous with their time. Kurt, of course, is an old colleague. Both are folklorists. Kurt's now the president of the American Folklore Society. MSU has been kind enough to lend him part-time to head that organization, and so I'm very pleased to be with them and thank them for their generosity. The Curb Center is an arts policy center with a difference, interested in creative enterprise, not only the nonprofit sector. And so it's great to be with you here in East Lansing. Back when I was chairman of the NEA, I mentioned that I grew up in the Upper Peninsula. I still pay not a lot of taxes. I pay some taxes here in Michigan because I own a home up on the shore of Lake Superior, just outside of Calumet, Michigan, where I graduated from high school in 1962. The last time I was actually on this campus was when I was brought down here as a National Merit Scholar semifinalist in the summer of '62 when Michigan State was trying to get me to come to school here, but instead, because of family pressure, both of my parents had attended the University of Michigan, and so that's where I went to school. But I have fond memories of that visit, and I often think that I would have chosen better had I chosen to come to school right here at Michigan State. And when I was with the NEA, I would drive. The government can take these fairly long holidays, and I would drive from Washington D.C. up to Calumet. And of course, when you're heading up north through the Lower Peninsula, you pass nearby Lansing, East Lansing, and I always was startled by the truth that when I passed Michigan State, I was almost exactly halfway between Washington and Calumet. I still had that far to go. This is a very big state, so it's great to be here. Even though the state is so large, I don't feel all that close to home. Here's my talk. You notice I got the date wrong. I got me talking tomorrow, but this is what the address is going to be about, and we're really talking about a couple of themes that I think are going to be very important. You saw the slide. I held up my book. You saw the slide of Arts Inc. And many of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about today are incubated or expressed in more elaborate form in Arts Inc., How Greed and Neglect Have Destroyed Our Cultural Rights. It was published a little more than a year ago. I mentioned the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in that book a number of times. It shows up a lot of different ways. The Calumet, of course, is today a poor, failed copper mining town. The mines began to decline really in the mid-1950s, and the last copper mine closed in 1966. But it's a culturally rich area. And I found as I reflected on the importance of culture to community and culture to individual lives, I kept coming back to my experience in the UP and remembering that when I was young, before my teenage years, there was a daily newscast on WHDF, the local station, at noon in the Finnish language, and the existence of that broadcast in Finnish on at that time our only AM radio station simply indicates how culturally diverse that community is, because there were many other cultural groups in many other languages that could have argued that they also deserved a newscast on that station. So I want to accomplish these two things today. Talk about some of the key markers in the evolving relationship between the Obama administration and its cultural agenda. And I also want to talk about a couple of new ideas that to me seem essential for those of us who care about the vibrancy of the cultural environment in America's towns and cities. Now, here's a beginning look at the Obama vision as it emerged, beginning fairly early in the campaign. The campaign issued promises to the arts community in January of 2008. And shortly thereafter, in February of 2008, a 40-member Arts Policy Committee was established. It was co-chaired by a TV producer and writer named George Stevens. He's based in Washington, D.C., and Margot Lyon, who's also a producer of Broadway shows from New York. The committee was greatly expanded in July. That's when I became a member. And the group conducted bi-weekly conference calls, and while policy was actually discussed, as you would expect, the committee predictably zeroed in on ways in which art and artists could help advance Barack Obama's then primary campaign, presidential campaign goals. A lot of it had to do with trying to raise money. Now, in the late summer of 2008, Bill Clinton's former chief of staff, a guy named John Podesta, he was my old boss when I was chairman of the NEA. He was my point of contact with the West Wing of the White House. He was asked to organize a secret government review process. And this was called the Obama Transition Project. And the Obama Transition Project, the goal was straightforward but hardly simple. This was about examining public documents to produce a 30-page report that highlighted the key policy and personnel issues in every agency of government. So that 30-pager was then going to be reduced to 2 pages, a 2-page summary, and the president-elect would have on his desk a fat notebook with 2 pages summarizing the key issues affecting every agency of government the morning after the election. That was the goal of the Obama Transition Project. Now, I was asked to review the NEA. My boss was a guy named Tom Wheeler. He's a venture capitalist based in New York, or based in Washington. And of course, we worked in absolute secrecy because the Obama project, smacked of measuring the drapes, assuming you were going to win the election long before any votes had been counted. Now, the Obama Transition Project was conducted entirely by phone and by email. And each participant pretty much worked alone. No assurance that we'd be part of the real transition should the candidate prevail. And of course, we know now that the candidate did in fact prevail. And I was brought forward to head the group that was addressing technology, science, and the arts. These are the campaign promises that we began with. These are the campaign promises that were extracted by Americans for the Arts from the Obama campaign actually during the primary. And if you look at them closely, you'll see that these are pretty much the old chestnuts of arts advocacy. Those of you who have been around the arts for a while, these are the things that have been desired by those who want additional engagement on the part of the federal government. The new item here is really this artist core, the idea of a group of artists who would be in communities paid by the federal government. And this idea has some legs today. But these were the Obama campaign promises. And here's the timeline that in which the Obama engagement with the art developed. So right now we're between the Obama Transition Project and the Obama Transition. I was asked by, as I say, Tom Wheeler to move from the project into the actual transition. And this is what we were working on. The top, above the line, we're doing agency review. We're looking at the various agencies of government in exactly the same way we did in the Obama Transition Project. That is, we're looking at issues of personnel, issues of of policy to see where the bodies are buried, to make sure that new political appointees could come in and hit the ground running. We were also tasked with figuring out who might be the new politically appointed leadership of the key cultural agencies. So our little team worked on NEA, National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is less known but a very important grant-making agency of government that supports libraries and museums. Now, I don't expect you to memorize this, but this is one of many pages in the description of how the transition would do its work, and I place it here just to give you a feeling for how things were structured. And you can see that there were a series of group leaders. I was in the group right below the center of the chart, the one that was science, technology, and the arts. And so we were kind of an odd combination. We were an odd cohort. There were about 300 of us working in the transition. It was part a kind of government agency in waiting. It was part a euphoric, successful political campaign, and it was something of an employment office, because I would say 2/3 of the people I worked with in the transition were very interested in moving from the transition into government. In fact, I think I was one of the few who from the outset said, no, I'll be here for 9 weeks and then I'm going to go back to Nashville. We were set up in the top 3 floors of a Department of Justice office building on 6th Street Northwest. So we were almost exactly 10 blocks east of the White House. And this is the very building. And we had the 7th, 8th, and 9th floors. Agency review was on 7. I would say the big dogs were on 8. That was John Podesta, Rahm Emanuel, various characters who were certain to move into the administration. And on the 9th floor, you had a suite of offices for the president and another suite for the vice president, and a press office and a space for press conferences. In our first meeting, we were photographed for Secret Service ID badges. We were issued Blackberries, assigned phone numbers, email addresses, and so on, and escorted to the 7th floor. And because Tom's group included science and technology, I was in a cluster with a bunch of Clinton-era political appointees who worked with agencies like the FCC, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Commerce, and so on. In fact, my office mate, Jim Nolenberger, was heading agency review for NASA, and that's the space agency, not the organization that works with state arts agencies, what I call the real NASA. But from the beginning, there was really more in play than creating documents for the incoming agency leadership and selecting qualified candidates for top political jobs. And I go back to this slide to look at what's below the line. You know, remember, our economy was in a 5-turn spin. That's George Bush's phrase in mid-November. And it was obvious to me from day one that the contents of the inevitable stimulus bill that was going to be assembled not by Nancy Pelosi. You know, it's always been called Nancy Pelosi's bill, which always intrigues me because it was almost entirely put together within the transition office. And from the outset, everybody was trying to get the agencies they worked with designated as a recipient for some of the federal money that was going to be certainly coming down the pike. Now, it's a story that could fill its own speech, and I'll answer questions later, and I'll be happy to take questions about it, but to cut to the chase, after a fascinating and slightly contentious process of internal advocacy and negotiation, I learned in January, and this was just at the 11th hour as we were closing the offices, that $50 million would go through the NEA to arts organizations around the nation as part of the stimulus, the economic stimulus effort to create and protect jobs. Now, the $50 million itself, those of you who track this, it became very controversial in Congress. A big fight between the Senate and the House. The Senate didn't put the money in the bill, and in fact, Tom Coburn authored an amendment to the bill that said no money would go for the arts or for dry heat saunas, light shows. He had a list of things that he was willing to treat dismissively, and money for the arts was one of them. And the amendment passed. But in conference, David Obey, the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, Nancy Pelosi, who got a phone call from Robert Redford, stood firm. And they said the House voted for the $50 million, and it's going to stay in. I swear the New York Times had the story already written. You know, NEA loses again. You know, they just assumed, there was just an assumption that that money was going to be taken out of the bill, but it wasn't. It stayed in. So that was part of it. Keep getting money for your agency as part of the transition job in that stimulus bill that was being crafted in that 6th Street office building. Now, I had my own agenda, and I call it the Journey West, and I argue about this at some length in Arts, Inc. During my tenure as NEA chairman, I had become convinced that arts and culture need to find a new way of connecting with the policy apparatus of the White House. Now, from 1965 on, when the agency was first created, through every presidency, into the Clinton administration, into the Bush administration, our cultural agencies have been linked to the executive branch through the White House Social Office and the Office of the First Lady. It was actually Hillary Clinton's office that recruited me to be NEA chairman. Thus has it always been. There are, after all, two wings in our White House. The West Wing, and that's the one that's been made famous on your right. It's the one that's been made famous by the long-running TV series. It's home to the Domestic Policy Council, the National Security Council, the Council of Economic Advisors, and so on. And then there's the East Wing on the left, where those of you who've attended White House events were screened through security. If you wanted to sneak into a White House dinner, you had to do it through the East Wing. It's also where the White House Social Office is located and where most of the offices of the First Lady are headquartered. So if the West Wing is about public policy, the East Wing is more about, well, parties and the social life of the White House. And although I hold all of America's First Ladies in the highest regard, the truth is that agencies that are linked to administration leadership through the social office simply don't acquire standing with real West Wing policymakers. And burdened by a thin connection to policy actors, the arts and the NEA have pretty much remained an amenity, albeit one that can quickly turn politically toxic. And that was, of course, the case when arts controversies dogged the elder President Bush during his second primary campaign, which ended up in the fights over Mapplethorpe and Serrano and John Frohnmeyer, then chairman of the NEA, losing his job. I hope to change things. So while I supervised transition agency review and we worked to assemble our list of NEA chairman candidates and lobbied to make arts workers part of the economic recovery package, I also peppered my transition colleagues with memos arguing that something I labeled an arts and culture portfolio should be positioned somewhere in the West Wing, probably in the Domestic Policy Council that was then being put together by an Obama advisor named Melody Barnes. And these are the things that I thought should be in there, in that cultural portfolio. And I kept trying to talk to my colleagues on the 7th floor about the obvious fact that authority in cultural matters was scattered all over government, and it would be good public policy to find a way for the Obama administration to consolidate its work with many agencies in one West Wing office. So what has happened? What's happened since the transition ended, and the threads of these campaign promises, stimulus money, the new appointments, the organization of the Obama White House, how, as these have all been knitted together, what's happened? Well, I think the news is mixed, basically good but mixed. The NEA, on the stimulus package, it did a first-rate job of distributing its money. This is how that money went out. I've heard that the Office of Management and Budget singled out the NEA as being, it was certainly one of the very first, perhaps the first agency to actually move money. Makes sense, they're grant makers. But single them out for the excellence of their program. You know, second, in Rocco Landsman, the president picked, I will say, the least mainstream candidate on our transition list. And I'm revealing for the first time that he was on our list because I know that Margot Lyon, one of my colleagues, has spoken to the New York Times about this, so it's no longer a secret that he was one of the 5 names that we sent along to the White House. But he was the one that no one in the arts community would have automatically recognized. Now, I'm convinced that Rocco's bold stance on the value of art and of the endowment and his focus on art in communities will ultimately significantly advance the NEA. And the idea of an artist corps, the idea of an artworks program with artists and communities does seem to have some traction. Not so much with the White House, but with congressional leaders like David Obey and Louise Slaughter and others who have supported the arts over the years. But I would say it's not all sweetness and light. I mean, the agency is currently operating with a budget of about $167 million, a little more than that. The president requested only $161 million in his budget request for fiscal 2011. That'll be for next year. Given the attention that's now focused on our overall federal budget deficit, it will be very tough for congressional supporters like Louise Slaughter and Jim Moran to add funding during the appropriations process. That's the way the NEA has gotten its advances in recent years. And I would say, you know, I talked about campaign promises. When I started with the campaign, these were campaign promises. By the time we started the transition, the economy was sinking. They became campaign objectives. And by the time we were splitting up the office, they became campaign goals. So that list, that impressive list, I think has somewhat been put aside. And then as to my dream of a coordinated West Wing link for the NEA and other government and cultural activities, well, at first it didn't look that promising. I was told that Mel Barnes had placed an arts and culture portfolio in the Domestic Policy Council in something called the Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation. The West Wing, nothing happened for months. But it seems now that this West Wing connection is coming to life. Barnes has hosted a meeting with arts leaders, did that back in January. And in February, Chairman Landsman began to regularly meet with the Domestic Policy Council. He meets with them once a month. That has never happened in the history of the NEA, so that part is very encouraging. So what can we learn from the campaign transition in the first months of the new administration? I think first, in a process burdened by federal deficits, the most we'll see is incremental growth in the NEA budget added by Congress, and we'll be lucky to get that. However, Rocco Landsman is willing to take some very strong positions on the arts. And it does feel that the timing may be right for a bolder message around the federal government and culture. You know, when I was chairman, we were all in a defensive crouch. You know, the Republican Congress had just been on the NEA for nearly a decade. And Rocco is temperamentally and intellectually not suited to a defensive posture, and I think he's delivering a bold message that I think may end up proving that the right-wing rhetoric that we've heard over the years is really mostly bluster. And if that message gets through, it will make it a lot easier for the White House to be supportive. But I do think that in the big picture, long-standing assumptions about how art and government interacts with culture have proven to be remarkably sticky. You know, we've kind of worked our way into an existential crisis. Certainly, the arts in Michigan are in a real crisis. But we'll have to work to continually reconfigure the arts and the way we think about arts and community. And I think we're caught, you know, somewhere between the First Lady's office, probably between the First Lady's office and the Office of Public Liaison and the Domestic Policy Council. I think we moved the issue at least to the middle, maybe a little bit all the way to the right toward the West Wing. So we're caught between 1 and 2, and though we're engaging 3. So art to date has pretty much remained in its traditional role. You know, the First Lady has attended some important art openings, but where's the President? The White House has hosted evenings featuring jazz, country, and classical music, but the events have been organized without any consultation with the NEA, the NEH, the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, or other sources of expertise within the government. So we've been pretty much in that traditional role. So that's where we are right today. What I'd like to do, and I'll refer to the federal situation a couple more times, but I really want to talk as I begin to conclude about a second point. What arts leaders must do if we are to create and sustain a deeper and more meaningful connection between art and our American democracy, our American communities. Now first, there's the arts, an amenity that can suddenly turn radioactive. I think we need a bigger policy frame. You know, we constructed a frame for the arts about 50 years ago, in the early days of foundation government spending. I think these are the four components that are in it. You know, we care about artists who work with the nonprofit community. We care about nonprofit arts organizations, mostly those focused on the fine arts. We certainly care about state and community grant-making agencies, and then K through 12 arts education, mostly music, mostly band. Policy questions and advocacy about the arts have pretty much been posed within this frame. So we strategize about ways for nonprofits to connect with minority neighborhoods, study the impact of arts facilities on real estate values, advance claims that music instruction improves in-school test performance, or the presence of a creative class will increase the city's appeal as a site for industrial relocation. Now, I think we've pushed the arguments within this frame about as far as they will go. In fact, there's a tone of desperation when we argue that arts improve test scores, or that artist studios will advance economic development, or the presence of some creative class will make a city an irresistible destination for industrial relocation. Probably one of the more crucial things I'll say today. The art forms within our frame constitute what an economist named Richard back in the 50s called merit goods. They're products and services that the government believes should be more widely available than would be the case if you could only go out and buy them. Government intervenes to make merit goods more available. There's nothing wrong with viewing arts as merit goods. It's just that the merit good frame, our merit good frame, is pretty weak when it's compared to things like subsidized public education, subsidized health care and housing for the poor, protected wetlands, subsidized antiviral drugs for AIDS victims in sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera, et cetera. Merit goods, after all, get ranked in order of importance. And those rankings are especially important in tough economic times. If you look at that list, you really see the things that what I think of as the big dog foundations, like the Clinton Foundation, the Gates Foundation. These are their priorities, and culture is at best a twig on a branch on a limb, far below these priorities. So I'm convinced that we need to think about a larger frame, a different kind of policy frame. I've always argued that while arts policy must address issues affecting the nonprofit arts, on a national level, I think we have to expand to take on the public interest impact of things like copyright law, trade policy in cultural goods, mergers and acquisitions in the media industries, access to cultural heritage, and to the tools of online creativity and learning. And that means thinking about how for-profit galleries interact with young painters, what Clear Channel Communications and its ownership of radio means to local broadcasting, the rights of citizens to engage cultural heritage, even if that cultural heritage, say old movies, old sound recordings, are owned by some multinational as corporate assets. In short, we must think about a broad system in which art is created, distributed, and preserved, analyzing and improving the ways that system intersects quality of life in our American democracy. And I've argued in Arts Inc. and in other places that we need to think about cultural rights. I'm going to run by that. I'll give you just time read it, and then I'll quickly move on. But a right is an assertion, a fundamental assertion, not based on evidence, based merely on argument. And I put these 6 rights forward in a speech to the National Press Club in December of 2000, about 10 days after the Supreme Court had decided Bush versus Gore. Believe me, very few people were interested in cultural rights 10 days after the Supreme Court decided the results of that election. So it didn't get a lot of attention. But it kind of stayed with me. I had other opportunities to speak about it. And it became the basis of Arts Inc. There's a chapter in the book organized around each of those rights. Beyond the rights, I talk about something called expressive life. And this is a slide that I'll come back to a little bit later in a different context. But to me, it's the broad term that denotes an area of knowing and doing that links artistic practice and access to the tools of creativity, connection with the past, engagement with novelty and innovation. In a broad frame, it really possesses some very powerful implications for quality of life. I use expressive life instead of art and instead of culture because I think those terms are kind of burdened. They've kind of lost their clear meaning. As a nation, an individual, or a community, if each of those three possess both strong links to heritage and ready access to the tools of individual voice, I believe you can claim a high quality of life. And from this connection to quality of life, expressive life can acquire the kind of gravitas that defines other policy sectors like healthcare, education, and the environment. So my selfish wish is that on a national level, you advocate on behalf of a more coherent connection between expressive life and government. Maybe arguing that we need, as you saw that slide go by quickly earlier, a Department of Cultural Affairs. We desperately need to consolidate and coordinate the way we work with culture in government. This is just a few of the agencies that own little pieces of what I would call the cultural policy pie. They each have some authority over our cultural system, in some cases some pretty dramatic authority. And they're the ones that determine the way our art system interacts with artists and citizens here and throughout the world. Now, this kind of vision is of necessity long-term and national in scope. But because most of the laws and regulations that define the playing field on which art gets created, moved around, transformed, consumed, is federal, this transformation will only occur after a patient advocacy effort. But I'd like to shift my focus away from Washington, as I really do wrap up today, take your questions, and talk about art and community policy objectives that I think offer a real opportunity for frontline leaders who want to talk about how arts connect here in the greater Lansing area and in other communities in Michigan. I met yesterday with Leslie Donaldson, with Kent Love, connected with your Arts Council here, and we talked about some of these issues. Here's our, just as we had an old frame nationally, I think we have kind of an existing frame for art at the community level. We also need to change this frame and think broadly about the quality of the expressive lives of individuals and communities. And that means moving beyond nonprofit K-12 frame to gather up an array of indicators that together determine the cultural vibrancy of the city. When I put creative class up there, I mean, that stands for all of the STEM pressure to create everything and all work and economic impact. So I'm talking about community studies that count movie screens. I'm going to leave this up for a while so you can look at it, but count movie screens, independent bookstores, library branches, art galleries. I'm talking about measuring the penetration of high-speed internet services, cable television in poor neighborhoods, calculating the number of nightclubs that feature live local music, the number of locally owned radio television stations, counting about talking about counting the number of community schools of the arts, and of course, attendance at symphony concerts and museum exhibitions. But when it comes to arts education, now here's a controversial idea. Let's not just count nonprofits and public school activities, but also think about private music teachers, for-profit music instrument retailers who are giving lessons in their stores as part of this new broad assessment of the music education scene. We've learned from the studies by Wolf Brown, arts consultant, and others, that attendance at the activities of traditional fine arts nonprofits, that is, the institutions in big gray limestone buildings in the heart of cities, that attendance has steadily been declining over the last decade. Communities, however, community arts are on the growth side of the curve, because you and your counterparts are at the very center of the explosion of real arts participation. And I'm suggesting here is a new kind of community study or survey carried out within a broad conceptual frame designed to measure every marker of a vibrant community expressive life. A survey that looks at these elements and how weak or strong they are in any particular city. The notion would be to engage citizens and leaders of government in celebrating real arts engagement, finding areas of strength and weakness, and adopting policy to strengthen where things are weak and celebrate where things are strong. So we're talking about a community cultural plan, a compilation and analysis of the results of such a study would enable a logical next step, the creation of a community cultural plan designed to protect arenas of accomplishment, repairing or improving areas of efficiency. Now, there are targets of opportunity out there. You know, there's a bill coming down the pike that the President should soon sign that will expand low-power FM radio opportunities for nonprofits. There is an opportunity to begin to revitalize localized broadcasting if nonprofits get in line, get these licenses. Most of them have gone out, I'll be honest, to religious organizations. But cultural nonprofits are perfect candidates to own and manage low-power FM stations that have a reach of 3 to 5 miles. And so you plant one in the middle of a mid-sized town and it can have real impact. Watch for targets of opportunity. Now, what do we get if we study our communities and culture in our communities in a new way and look at expressive life and find ways to enhance expressive life? Now, this is just an assertion, but this is what I think we get. We get an affordable pathway to a high quality of life, even in tough economic times. That's really one of the great questions facing our society that doesn't get talked about much. How then shall we live if we're not as rich as we thought we were, when we could borrow too much on a home we couldn't afford and spend the equity on a vacation that we probably didn't really need? How then do we live? I think expressive life is one route to that objective. Here's expressive life again. Heritage, connection with the past, community, belonging, voice, your individual expression, your political speech, your artistry, what separates you from community and distinguishes you as an individual, things that are not especially expensive, things that are available and satisfying, even if we're not quite as rich as we were 2, 3, 4, or 5 years ago. So I think we have a real opportunity to lead at the national level and at the community level, to use a fresh look at defining art and art engagement to craft a high quality of life in the society that is likely to come. And I think arts leaders at the community level are well positioned to move us to the next level. Here's a Barack Obama quote, and I think we have in our president a leader who is uniquely connected with culture and artistry through his work as a writer and through his biography and his connection with multiple cultures around the world. I fear that around him, he's surrounded by people who don't care as much or know as much about the power of culture in community. But I think he gets it. So the challenge will be to provide every policy opportunity for this leader in his age to take us where we know arts and community, arts and society need to go. So I'll stop there and ask you for any questions. Thank you.